We Victorianists are hostile to the very notion of a hero. You would be too if you'd had to read all of Thomas Carlyle's On Heroes and Hero Worship in order to pass your orals. Fortunately, our reading list provides an antidote to Carlyle's book in the form of Thackeray's Vanity Fair, subtitled A Novel Without a Hero. There we learn that the desire for a hero is the most deluded and therefore the deepest of all vanities. Making a hero of someone may look like a form of humility because we seem to be acknowledging the superiority of the person we've heroized, but often we're just projecting our ideals onto another person so that we won't have to carry the complete responsibility for living up to them, and we can blame someone else when we become disillusioned, as we inevitably do. Thackeray thought that our need for heroes therefore leads to rigidity, prejudice, snobbery, an inability to appreciate ordinary virtues, irresponsibility, and perhaps most surprisingly, cynicism. Thackeray never tired of pointing out that where heroes be, villains are sure to appear. This is a truth that we've encountered even in the recent history of our own discipline. Remember the Paul de Man affair, for example. It's a telling example of what's dangerous about needing intellectual heroes. Paul de Man was an extraordinarily talented critic who had an enormous effect on the profession. When it was discovered after his death, he had written for a fascist newspaper in his youth and had never revealed that fact to his friends and colleagues. Some of his heroizers seemed unable to accept the fact, and they fashioned narratives that would keep him heroic. For example, I'm sure you all remember that a few of his supporters cited his essay on Rousseau as proof that he had thought hard about confessing, but had then decided that it was somehow more honest to keep his past to himself. Now, those who had never liked de Man's theory, in contrast, were appalled by that line of argument and insisted on making him a full-blown villain and a purveyor of a kind of self-interested ideology. Neither side could then recognize what now seems the obvious fact that de Man's wartime journalism was irrelevant to his greatness as a critic and a theorist. And in this case, neither side maintained a distinction that is basic to the professional functioning of any true discipline, the distinction between what philosophers of science sometimes call the context of discovery, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the context of justification. Now, for the sake of argument, let's imagine that de Man's own struggle with the question of whether or not he should talk about his wartime collaboration was actually the context in which he discovered his analysis of Rousseau's Confessions. Let's imagine that this actually provided the insight. Both his supporters and his detractors imagined that to have been the case. His supporters thought the context of discovery was evidence of the man's troubled but nevertheless intact good faith. His detractors thought the essay's context of discovery contaminated not only de Man's ideas about Rousseau, but also his entire theoretical system, revealing the very idea of undecidability to be deeply immoral. By encouraging the conflation of the personal and the intellectual, heroizing seems to me to be the first step on this treacherously slippery slope. The landslides it can create imperil our ability to discuss the merits of ideas in themselves, to keep them inside the normal protocols of academic debate, or what's called the context of justification, which is the arena in which we most strictly hold ourselves responsible for thinking rigorously about each other's ideas. It is the place where we try to avoid all forms of tendentiousness, including ad hominem judgments, positive or negative. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to try to problematize the application of this distinction, context of discovery, context of justification, which is drawn, after all, from the procedures of the natural sciences to our profession. But for now, I just want to leave it standing as a very strong version of a norm that I think is generally practiced in academic disciplines. I'm thankful that our profession is now in a much less heroic age than it was when Paul de Man was at its center. And that may be why I hesitate to revive the dynamics of charisma by nominating new heroes. So before I name any names, let me make yet another cautionary distinction. I don't, after all, want to leave the impression that scandal is always just around the corner whenever we examine the context of discovery. That is, when we see an idea as the emanation of a peculiar personality. My point, rather, is that the context of justification is where we should try to remain when we are dealing with the work of our contemporaries and near contemporaries. And therefore, depersonalization is what we should strive for. Instead of wanting to contemplate that perfect blend of personal qualities and intellectual achievements, we should instead pay each other the respect of consistent, close attention and honest engagement. So the distinction I'm making now is between the way we view and review each other on the one hand, and the way we approach the lives and works of the writers who are the objects of our scholarly and historical attention on the other. I think we almost instinctively observe that difference. That's why so many of us would name, if we had to, intellectual heroes who lived quite some time ago, who are by now historical, or who have become legendary and probably were already legendary when we ourselves were students. We rightly explore their context of discovery so that we can understand and process our disciplinary history as well as the histories of the literatures we study, obviously. And in pursuing those histories, we learn that the very distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, that tacit understanding about the irrelevance of each other's private motivations and status when judging each other's ideas, that very distinction itself obviously had a context of discovery in the needs of a certain category of people during the late 18th and 19th centuries to create a secular, public, intellectual, and eventually academic sphere. The story of the struggle for that secular platform, the one we're all sitting and standing on right now, without which academic freedom, for example, would have been impossible, is too well known to need rehearsing. It's come down to us in numerous versions, among which Jürgen Habermas's is probably predominant still in my thinking. As a shorthand, let me just name a few names in the English-speaking world who built this platform: Adam Smith, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Percy Shelley, John Stuart Mill, Matthew Arnold, George Eliot, Charles Darwin. I'm sure you can, come in a chorus with more and more names. These people would be my heroes if I had heroes, although I actually tend to think of them more as giants than as heroes, because they made it harder to discredit the ideas, anybody's ideas, on the grounds that they come from sources without the proper ascribed status, or sources that we might consider morally tainted. The kind of personal integrity I most admire in my colleagues, moreover, is that which upholds the distinctions these giants created, even when upholding them is unpopular. When, for example, a committee of a learned society that shall go unnamed here debated the nomination of Hans Robert Jauss for an honorary membership in its ranks, a nomination that was finally not made, largely because of Jauss's wartime membership in the Waffen-SS, I have to admit that I admired those who argued, however privately, for this was not a public discussion, that his probable war crimes were not relevant to a judgment of his achievements as a scholar and a theorist. I understood the desire to avoid a fractious controversy, but it nevertheless seems to me a retreat from a principle we should be prepared to defend when we make that sort of decision. I've not yet, though, named a single professional value, other than perhaps impartiality, on which we should judge each other's work. And perhaps some of you are becoming a little impatient with my emphasis on the negative, on the kinds of judgments we shouldn't make, but are all too often encouraged to make by the dynamics of charisma. So let me attempt in these last few minutes to say, if not what I find heroic, than at least what I take to be signs of great literary criticism, which is, I think, after all, what we all want to do. What I'm about to say will further complicate the distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, and it will also call into question the adequacy of a purely Habermasian model of intellectual judgment to our profession. It might also, though, help explain why this discipline, and here I'm sort of resonating with things that Deirdre Lynch was saying earlier, may be peculiarly hero-prone and villain-prone. What you're about to hear is a very short phenomenology of the experience of reading great criticism. These are 7 signs you may be encountering a great critic. And they're drawn, I had 10, but I had to cut them down. And they're drawn from my reaction to reading critics I most admire. 1, great criticism does not strike you as being either in or out of harmony with things you already know or believe. 2, on first encountering the writings of a great critic, you feel the thrill of being outside your professionally trained mental habits. 3, when you read more of that critic's work, even after you've come to know and assimilate his or her ways of thinking and writing, you nevertheless have a persistent sensation of admiration. In the strong root acceptation of that word, you are surprised, you are astonished, you wonder, you marvel. 4, even on reading the best work of such a critic, it never seems to get old, to lapse into a routine, or to be imitable. 5, you imitate it. 6, you notice that great critics never sound like anyone else, and that they do not always sound like themselves. 7, even though you do not actually agree with the conclusions of a great critic, they make a lasting change in the way you read literature. Well, in formulating this list of the top 6 signs you are reading a great critic, I have 2 critics of my own generation and from my own field in mind, David Miller and Elaine Scarry. But as I describe my reactions to reading them, you probably recognized your own experiences reading other critics, perhaps critics in your own field. I know and esteem both David Miller and Elaine Scarry, although I'm not nominating them as heroes. It is their writing, after all, that compels my admiration. But you will have noticed that my description of their effects, and even my use of the word compels, conjures the dynamics of charisma. What else could it be? When we read great critics, we are responding not only to some abstract Habermasian better argument, but also to a combined deployment of logic and rhetoric, of comprehension and insight, out of which our minds will necessarily construct a persona. Even rhetorical impersonality is easily absorbed into such a construction, feeding our enormous prosopopoetic desire, the desire to construct the face behind the text, to borrow a term and a concept that used by both Damon and Hillis Miller. In short, we respond most fully to the critic whose works have virtues overlapping with those of the literary authors we read. Therefore, in the very endeavor to give them the fullest attention, that kind of respect, we tend to collapse both the context of discovery and the context of justification. That is, we make up a source, even if we don't quite know what it is. We collapse that binarism and also the distinction between an object of study and a contemporary fellow critic. So does that mean that admiration necessarily, because of peculiarities in our particular discipline, lapses into hero-making? I don't think it needs to. The profession also gives us the elementary tools to avoid the kinds of strong libidinal cathexes that seem dangerous to me. It forces us, for example, to keep in mind the difference between a person and a persona, elementary. And it gives us that useful habit called aesthetic distance that was actually thoughtfully built into the secular public arena for the very purpose of protecting admiration from the intemperate emotional investments of partisanship. So I am very interested in Emerson's issue of how do you defend yourself against the hero, against the charismatic. For the sake of preserving admiration, then, I'll try to follow Thackeray's advice and continue to live an intellectual life without a hero. Thank you.